So Salah Uddin is born in 1137. Where was he born? In Tikrit, in Iraq. And he wasn't an Arab, he was a Kurd. Nuruddin also was not an Arab, which shows you, subhanAllah, that the connection to Al-Aqsa has to transcend Arabism. Has to transcend that. It has to be a cause of the Ummah. Imaduddin was not an Arab, Nuruddin was not an Arab, Salahuddin was not an Arab. And subhanAllah, there are some who even tried to connect Salahuddin to an Arab ancestor to make him Arabi. It didn't matter, and it doesn't matter what you can find in his lineage or if you can try to connect him to an Arab ancestor. This is a cause that's greater than the Arab. This is the cause of Islam and the Muslims. This is the cause of every single person, and the one who connects their hearts and efforts to it is just as connected to it as anyone else, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes sacred links through what physical links cannot make. And so there are different claims that are made to Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. By the way, funny enough, even after the glorious chapter of Salahuddin will close, some of the Europeans will try to justify in their minds how such a great man rose amongst the Muslims, who they had portrayed as barbarians and as lowly people all this time. How did the greatest general of their time arise from them? And their conclusion in some of their books was that he had a European mother. And so he had to come from something else, because it doesn't make sense otherwise for him to be this person. And I want to say about Salah Uddin Al-Ayubi rahimahullah ta'ala before we continue, that this is a man who, subhanAllah, when you talk about qabul, when you talk about acceptance in the hearts of the believers, has been given a status in the ummah that is unparalleled. I want you to think about the amount of time that has passed from his time to our time, and the way that his name has been invoked generation after generation after generation. That is enough to tell you what a special person he is in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he has been in the hearts of believers for over an entire millennia. It's unprecedented, it's unheard of for someone that comes that far after the Sahaba to have that type of a status amongst the believers. And when you read about him, he deserves it. He deserves every bit of that praise that he receives in the ummah. He deserves every bit of that acceptance, because this was a man who was born and bred and who lived and died with the ummah in his heart. A selfless human being, subhanAllah, who had vision, who had sincerity that is unparalleled in his time. And I also want you to appreciate the circumstances that he was born in, and how close he actually was to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I was trying to reflect on this context. The time between us and Salahuddin is 1,000 years. The time between the context of Salahuddin, not necessarily the birth of Salahuddin, the context of Salahuddin and the death of the Prophet ﷺ is 400 years. That means that the effect of that generation of the Prophet ﷺ and the generation that immediately followed is very much so still present. Like, I think about this in an American context. They talk about slavery being 400 years old. The effects are still very present. There are easy ways to trace your lineage. You know who your great-great-great-grandfather was. If you look hard enough, you can trace the development of villages and cities. You can see the same structures. That's how close it is to the Prophet ﷺ. And so that should help you appreciate that there is something very special that's still in the air to be salvaged, and that makes the destruction of a place like Jerusalem and the pillaging of the Muslim world that much sadder in his time. And so you have this man, rahimahullah ta'ala, that's a Khalid ibn al-Walid-like figure, the greatest general in this ummah after Khalid radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who we would have the great victories on his hand. What is his actual name? What is his actual name? Does anyone know? His actual name is Yusuf. His actual name is Yusuf. And Salahuddin is the honorific that is given to him, rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is deeply profound because it will factor into the way that he lives his life, rahimahullah ta'ala. His father was a general under Imaduddin, whose name was Najmuddin. His father, Najmuddin, was a general under Imaduddin. Remember, Imaduddin is the father in Iraq And when he dies, his son Nur-ad-Din, his second son, assumes the rulership of the dynasty based out of Syria, based primarily out of Syria. So he's a general under Imad-ud-Din al-Zengi, rahimahullah ta'ala. And before Salah ad-Din was born, his mother had an interesting dream about him that she went to the dream interpreters with. She said, I saw a dream that in my stomach was a sword. And so subhanAllah, you talk about a ru'ya and a prophecy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring out of this man. His mother saw him as a sword in her stomach before she actually gave birth to him, rahimahullah ta'ala. And subhanAllah, what happens on the very day that he's born is that his father, his mother, who just gives birth to him, have to flee from Tikrit because of an attack. So you can imagine the day of his birth, he's a refugee. He's on the move on the day of his birth. His father is expelled the day of his birth. And as they are on the run, one of the generals says to his father, Najmuddin, that this baby of yours must be bad luck. It's got to be bad fortune. Right? The day of his birth, you're expelled and you're on the run from Tikrit to Mosul in Iraq, right? Both in Iraq. So this baby must be of bad fortune. And he responded and he said, rather it may be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has planned through him a good fortune that we can't comprehend. There might be something in his qadr that is way beyond anything that we can perceive. And so I think about those children that are born in Gaza that were born while their parents were on the run, and perhaps babies that were born, subhanAllah, that will never know their parents. Babies that showed up in the makeshift hospitals and their parents had been killed in the same bombing. Allah Azza wa Jal knows what may come out of this generation of genocide. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give izzah to this generation. Allahumma ameen. And so they're fleeing to Mosul, where Imad-ud-Din, the father is, Imad-ud-Din Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, and he takes in the soldiers who fled, including his general, Najmuddin Al-Ayubi, the father of Salah Uddin rahimahullah ta'ala. Eventually, as we said, Imad-ud-Din will pass away, and Nur-ad-Din assumes the rule in Syria. So Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala is going to grow up in what city? In Damascus, in Dimashq. And as he grows up, to give you the context of Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala, the sentiment around him, everything was anti-crusader. Everything is anti-crusader. Everything from the culture to the poetry to the stories. And so that's one very important context to have, that he's born in the devastation of the crusaders. And the crusaders have Jerusalem. And he's born in the shadow of Nur-ad-Din al-Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, who will become his greatest mentor. That's number one. Number two, there's a defeatist atmosphere, that the Muslims will not be able to fight back this monster of the crusaders. And I think about our day and age, you think about the climate, Anashid al-Intifada, and the different poetry and the different songs that children are nurtured with. And it's important for them to not just have those songs and to have that poetry and to have that connection, but to also believe that that connection will eventually manifest in victory. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us that these songs will not stay in our ears alone. That this poetry will not merely be recited on our tongues as we are distant. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will see us through. So he grows up in an anti-crusader climate, but a defeatist climate as well. He also grows up in the masjid that became a focal point, subhanAllah, in the last few weeks. Qaddar Allah ma sha fa'al, the Umayyad masjid. He grows up in that masjid. That's the masjid that he memorized the Quran in. That's the masjid that he learned the fiqh of Imam al-Shafi'i in and became a master of the Shafi'i madhab. That is the masjid that he grew up playing in, that he grew up practicing his military arts in. Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala grows up as a student of knowledge. Simultaneously, he grows up as a warrior. He learns everything from religion to astronomy to Greek philosophy to diplomacy to the arts to everything about military skill. And subhanAllah, he takes a deep interest to the legend of Nur-ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala, even more so than his immediate relatives, to the legend of Nur-ad-Din, as well as the scholars that are around him. So he loves the ulama and he grows up in the shade of the scholars and he praises the scholars. So he could grow up to either be a scholar or a warrior or both. But he looks at Nur ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala as an absolute hero. And Nur ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala sees in Salah Uddin a very special kid and spends time investing in Salah Uddin rahimahullah ta'ala and mentoring him as well. And so it's only at the age of 14 that he becomes an official soldier in the Zengi dynasty directly under the command of his uncle Asaduddin. You'll notice a lot of Uddins. I'm sorry. Inshallah ta'ala, you'll be able to capture them. So his father is Najmuddin, his uncle is Asaduddin, his mentor and the leader is Nur ad-Din. There we go. Hopefully you all memorized it by now, inshallah ta'ala. I won't take you further than that. So he becomes a commissioned soldier in the Zengi dynasty under his uncle, Asaduddin, who in Western literature is also Shirku. And as he grows and flourishes under him, he's quickly ascending the ranks of the military. Now, by the way, this is an important point. Salah Uddin rahimahullah ta'ala, in terms of physical stature, actually was not very big. He actually didn't have a dominant physical stature, and so it was easy to overlook him in the ranks of the military. But his haiba, his awe-inspiring presence and what he was able to do, pushed him through in ways that he was gaining the attention of everyone within the ranks of the military. Nur ad-Din is receiving the reports of this growth of his father, until he passes away, is seeing Salah ad-Din, his uncle is seeing him. And so eventually, the year 1164 comes, and Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala is appointed as a commander of a battalion to engage Egypt. Egypt is under ad-Dawla al-Fatimiyya, is under the Fatimid dynasty, which at that point is the largest superpower in the Muslim world. The Abbasi Khilafah is really a small Khilafah. It's more symbolic than anything else at that point. So it's the most dominant force in the Muslim world. And this is where, subhanAllah, you start to see the wit of Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala. That Salah ad-Din is a Sunni scholar and warrior. He represents a Sunni dynasty, right? And we're talking about a dynasty that, again, is further than even mainstream Shi'ism. So we're talking about ideologically two different powers, but he's patient. Salah ad-Din rahimahullah sees an opportunity to build from within Egypt. And so he goes into Egypt, and through negotiations, his uncle becomes a wazir initially, his uncle becomes a minister under the Fatimid dynasty, under Dawla al-Fatimiyya, despite everything that is happening there. And eventually, his uncle passes away, and Salah ad-Din rahimahullah ta'ala is appointed as a wazir, appointed as a minister under the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. So there, he not only trains battalions and develops an army, he consolidates all sorts of power. For one, he builds universities and madaris all throughout Egypt in the same mold that Nur ad-Din did in Syria. So he starts to build madaris throughout, madaris of hifd of Quran, and learning creed and learning jurisprudence and to grow the scholars. He increases, subhanAllah, this is really interesting, but he saw that it was important to increase the wage of the teachers. If you want to look at how a society values education, look at the way that it pays its teachers, right? And so it tells you a lot about how Islamic scholars can be valued and how imams can be valued and how teachers, those that teach your children, can be valued. And it's important for a society to be uplifted in that way and to have education prioritized. And so he increases the office of the educators, if you will. He builds these glorious madaris all across. And in the process, he also becomes a noted orator. So he's giving khutbah in Egypt. He's a general in Egypt. He's building madaris in Egypt. His popularity is growing. He survives multiple assassination attempts. SubhanAllah, it's remarkable how many times this man was almost killed. Now, one time in Egypt, he's literally stabbed in his helmet, in his head, and he doesn't die, rahimahullah ta'ala. So he survives multiple assassination attempts because some people are wary of his power. He slowly starts to change things. The adhan was altered to hayya ala khayr al-amal. come to the best of deeds. So he slowly starts to bring things back to hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, bringing them back to the deen, growing with the people. And then he finds an opportunity. He's still technically paying allegiance to the Fatimid leader within the dynasty. As he gives his khutbah, he makes dua for him. But he finds an opportunity to suddenly push the boundaries, and he omits the name of the ruler of the Fatimids in his khutbah. The leader of the Fatimids passes away. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala assumes a greater role of power as a natural leader amongst the people. He changes the allegiance in the official sense, symbolically to ad-Dawla al-Abbasiyya, to the Abbasid Khilafah. And he continues to now consolidate his power, and I'm omitting a lot of details because of time. He continues to grow and consolidate his power throughout the region. So the madaris that he built are systematically upon what he has put, as well as older madaris like Al-Azhar is changed to fit a coordinated curriculum that grows the people in the deen across the board, and again fits the mold of what Nuruddin rahimahullah put into motion. And so subhanAllah, you can imagine the religious transformation of Egypt, the psychological transformation of Egypt under Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. He then secures the Hajj routes. Because remember, the Crusaders would attack the Hajj routes, and even the Fatimids, at least under Al-Hakim bi-Amrillah, they banned the Hajj. So he secures the Hajj routes from Egypt and Sudan, and this makes him extremely popular with the people. And so he becomes known as the defender of the Hajj, because he secures the route of the pilgrims. He then captures Yemen. So if you think of a mind map of what Salahuddin is doing, he takes Egypt and then he captures Yemen. And by capturing Yemen, he gains control over the ports, over the Red Sea. And by having control over the Red Sea, he's able to import and export using the ports and enrich the economy under his rule in Egypt as well as Yemen. And so his power is quickly growing. And by the way, this is all happening within a matter of 3 years. This isn't taking decades. This is unfolding rapidly.